Welcome to Every Step Podcast. I'm Krystyna, Weston.
And I'm Judith, Beck.
Every Step is the podcast where career and life meet.
With a new guest every episode, we explore the gutsy issues affecting everyone in the workplace.
Today we are joined by Dr Wesley Payne McClendon, where we discuss the habits of successful leaders in times of crisis.
Welcome, Wesley. It's so great to have you here. And today we're going to be talking about the habits of leaders in crisis. Now, we all know that when things are going great, it's probably a heck of a lot easier to lead. But what happens when all of a sudden the world changes? And as a leader, you have to make changes and you have to do things. So today, let's talk about what it is that leaders, the type of skills and the type of things that leaders need when they go through the crisis. And I'm going to throw out an easy question first. And I'm going to ask you if leaders are born or are they made? And I'll start with you, Wes.
Yeah, look, I think it's a combination of the two. The idea of nurture and nature. There are people who are born leaders, and you see that in various examples. I see that in sports quite easily, where people are gathered around an individual who can lead them, who can kind of talk the talk and walk the walk. You see that in corporate, where people have been seen to almost kind of get people to come around them as if they were a king or queen and want to be around them in a very real sense. But I think we have to be careful to recognize that leaders in crisis, whether they're born or made, it's contextual. So where a leader may draw many people to them quite naturally in one situation, that doesn't necessarily transfer to another situation where they would have equal mandate or ability to lead in a different situation. So as long as we understand that they can be both made, as in teaching one to be a leader, but also born, it is contextual. As my professor Rothwell used to say, it depends.
It depends. I think anyone can learn anything if they want to. They have to want to. They have to want to be that or make that change within themselves. But the mere word crisis means you're not ready. I mean, if you were ready for it, it wouldn't be a crisis, right? So it's really around how do you prepare yourself, or how do you build the base skills that are going to stand the test of time, whether you're in a crisis or just make you a good leader, but they're actually going to support you when there is something left field, when there is something that you're not expecting, when there is something that comes like a lightning bolt and you're not ready for it, and your crisis management plan, you can't just pull it off the top shelf. So I think they're the kind of crises that I'd like to have a conversation about today.
Yeah, look,
it's a very good
I was just going to say quickly that the idea is to build almost crisis capability, so that, again, I'll use a sports analogy. In American football, we run at the end of practice 2-minute drills, and you're given literally a stopwatch, and you're given 2 minutes to score from whatever position you are on the field. The reason they do a 2-minute drill at the end of practice is so that you've had the exhaustion of practicing in a game-like situation. But what you're given is this 2 minutes to perform at a high level of complexity, uncertainty, volatility, and crisis. The reason they do that is twofold. One is so you get used to performing in crisis, such that two, when you do have to perform in that crisis, it's quote unquote business as usual.
Exactly.
So you've built capability to perform regardless of what comes at you. And I think the most important component of that is this notion of being able to reflect upon how you responded to this particular component of the crisis or the other, so that you can effectively reflect, deconstruct, and then put back together the more appropriate or better or even more valuable behavior of leadership, such that when that crisis comes about the next time, whether it be a 2-minute drill or actually at the end of a game, you're ready to perform much like it was just another 2 minutes throughout the game.
And that's from a situation, if you think about it, right from the very beginning. So if we kind of go into that born or made, kids at school and the skills that they need at the very early stages of their development. And that carries on into high school, then into college, and then obviously at work. So those types of skills and those habits that they need to learn at a very young age are the made part. And I know, I mean, when I used to interview executives all the time when I had my search firm, and seriously, you could interview dozens of executives that have high charisma. They walk the talk. All show and no go is what I used to call them, because they were very convincing about how good they were, but the results weren't there, and they couldn't manage in a crisis. And then you'd have the ones which I called the silent achievers, the true leaders. And they were the ones who had those consistent habits of what they needed to be able to make a decision quickly, have the thought process in it, but also more importantly, because during the crises over the years that I've seen, there wasn't a plan. It was like the companies they had their disaster recovery plans, but that's a different one. But they didn't have a crisis plan to sort of say, if this happens, they panicked. So the ones that weren't good leaders panicked and made harsh decisions like redundancies and restructures too soon.
Yeah. And look, I think it kind of gets back to this idea of practicing crisis. It is giving people, within a team, tasks that stretch their boundaries so that, again, because what tends to happen in crisis, and I'm sure you know this as well, you revert back to what you know best, to what you've done before, regardless of whether it's been successful or not. You kind of fall back into your comfort zone. So the idea is to build capabilities so that your comfort zone becomes one that can function at all levels of crisis, again, as it would be termed business as usual, so that you're not stressed because there's a crisis coming through the door. You're good because you and your team have managed this type of crisis before, or you've built the capability within yourself and your team so that regardless of whether you've seen that crisis before or not, you're able to leverage those capabilities such that it would appear, yep, I've never seen this before, but I have the capability and the leadership to be able to move through that crisis with not a lot of consternation. So to your point, when you see people respond to crisis and they're pulling their hair out, those that have hair are able to kind of pivot in a way so that they can say, okay, cool. And look, one of the articles that I wrote talks about the fast brain leader. And in that article, I talk about being able to identify patterns of behavior, to develop shortcuts, so that what you're able to do is recognize the bigger picture, i.e. the patterns of behavior, so that you're able to know where to pull resources, certain people that may act a certain way in certain situations, others that may act differently, but to be able to pull those resources together and to give them responsibility for doing what they do best. And your responsibility is to manage that external piece. So you're not getting, way into the weeds, which tends to happen. Hopefully we'll talk about this idea of remote leadership. But if you're able to develop purpose and share that purpose with others, your main piece in the context of crisis is to let go of control and to trust the skills and capabilities of the leaders that you've put into place. You can literally get in the way of leadership. You can literally get in the way of people managing crisis by micromanaging or effectively getting in the way of their progress. So again, if you're able to step back, build that capability, give up control, and have the trust that allows people to do what they do best, you'll be better suited for managing crisis and leading through it.
And this takes an enormous amount of personal awareness and work on yourself. And I just want to pick up on one of the comments you were making earlier around a good leader. You were using the sports analogy, takes time to reflect and deconstruct and to invite a review of what's happened. But for a lot of people, that would make them exceptionally uncomfortable. How many leaders do you believe, or just in terms of the work you're doing, how comfortable do you think leaders are around having that real deconstruction, warts and all, to kind of go, okay, we didn't play this well. Let's make it about the activities, not the person. Let's make it about the actions, not about a personal thing. And how can we do this better? Are people doing that? Because my sense is that it would be very few leaders that would be open to that kind of vulnerability.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in all the points that you've made. I think one of the critical points that leaders don't do, in fact, if I step back for a second, when I talk to leaders, whether it's in a coaching or mentorship capacity, the first thing I do is I say, let me see your schedule and let me see your budget, because this is how they spend their time and this is how they spend their money. And so what you'll tend to see is a diary that has a ton of meetings, but there's no opportunity to reflect. And I know when I was at Ernst & Young, I used to have my EA schedule my meetings so that I would have obviously the time at the meeting, but I would have a time after the meeting to reflect on what took place. And I call them, reflecting on critical incidents, whether it's a meeting, a speech, an interaction in the hallway, whatever the case may be. You have to give yourself an opportunity to reflect on that critical incident. And as I said before, reflect upon it, pull it apart, and then reconstruct it based on the idea that you've now reflected on it. How could I have done that better? That interaction with someone I hadn't seen for a period of time, or leading a meeting, or even sitting back and giving someone else the stage. How could I have supported them better? So if you don't have literally on your schedule or within your diary an opportunity, I guess most likely right after that interaction, at the very least at the end of the day, to reflect on those critical incidents, you're missing an incredible opportunity to reflect upon yourself and to evaluate how you can do these things much better.
Because we're so busy rushing, right? We're so busy rushing from meeting to meeting. And, the throwaway line is, I'm busy, I'm busy, I'm busy, I'm so busy. But that doesn't actually achieve anything in the long run. And it doesn't enable us to have the insights that we need to be better leaders.
No, because you'll continue to do the same thing over and over. In that article that I mentioned, the Fast Brain Leader, I talked about how pretty much what we do has already been constructed in an unconscious existence, where about 95% of what we do is repetitive. So we've got a small window of opportunity to look at what we do, whether that's, brushing your teeth, putting the toothpaste on with your left hand, brushing with your right hand. I've got a electric thing, so it's 30 seconds each, of the four components of my mouth. But we do these things over and over again without recognizing, or again, pulling back and saying, how can I do this differently or better or get more out of it? And again, looking at those patterns of behavior, the only way that you're going to do something different is by recognizing what you do all of the time. And the importance of pulling those patterns of behavior apart, being able to say, it's kind of like autopilot. One of my buddies from school is a captain and flies in the US. And I said, tell me about what it's like to fly on autopilot. He said, we actually only fly the plane when we take off and land, and everything else is on autopilot. Why? Because the systems and processes within the plane allows them to recognize different patterns, of, the altitude, the wind, the thrust, all of these various things that we literally can't process all of that information. But the idea is to get ourselves so that we can function on autopilot, in effect, being able to see and sense all of these various things that are happening and adjust ourselves accordingly. And you can't do that in real time. You have to do that upon reflection.
Right. But well, they'd have to be used to the bird strike. Right.
Exactly right.
If that happens, what do we do now?
Exactly.
Whether or not, okay, because the reflection side, like 100%. But do you think a lot of the leaders today are a bit, they don't sort of spend the time with their teams to do that reflection or provide that critique about, okay, this didn't work so well, didn't work so we need to do it this way, and because they're worried about hurting someone's feelings, or they might take it the wrong way. How are companies going to get that kind of culture built where people are willing to take critique and reflect on their processes, that we're not doing this right, we need to do it this way, without people feeling like they're being blamed?
Yeah, and that ties into innovation as well. It ties into it's okay to fail.
Yeah, it's okay to fail, and owning
your
mistakes.
Not only is it okay to fail, it's encouraged. I encourage people to fail big, like big, hairy failures, because we don't learn from success. We learn from failure. And again, that's such a critical way to look at it. And for example, it wouldn't be my place as a leader to go to one of my team and say, you did that wrong. The better play is actually to ask one of my direct reports, how do you think you did? Or making sure that they had an opportunity to reflect with me, even before that, to say, hey, listen, I want you to think about what took place. I mentioned this idea of an after action report, or post-crisis evaluation, whatever it is that you want to call this notion of reflecting on critical incidents. But the idea would be to give them the opportunity to reflect on what took place and then to have a conversation. Most of leadership, in my estimation, is having conversations with people about how they're doing, their development, and how you can support them. Leadership is not waving your finger and telling them how poorly they did. It's literally about asking one simple question: how can I support you? And whether you do that on a regular basis, which I would always say is, probably once a week. At the very least, it's every other week, which is why you should probably have at most somewhere between 5 and 6 direct reports as a kind of a tipping point. But the idea is you have to have those conversations on a regular basis, so that you're listening to them talk about what they're doing and how they're reflecting and changing and pulling apart things. And again, listening to that, you're getting in your mind how you can support them, and whether that's verbally to say, here's what I think we can do, that I can do to support you, or whether you do that by hearing it and providing them almost by stealth opportunities for them to learn and grow.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know who said it, but somebody famous said leadership is contagious. And it's so true, because, actions do speak louder to words. And if your staff and if people are seeing their leaders panicking and not reacting in the right way at a crisis point, that's going to filter through, just like if they see them doing the right behaviors on how to operate. And I mean, when we look at just the last crisis that we've gone through, there are things that probably really good leaders have done to turn the ship around. There's two different kinds. There's obviously the big corporate, but then there's also the companies and the leaders within smaller companies who have it really tough, because their whole livelihood is dependent on it. So they're kind of going, all right, this is bad. And, I've got all my money into this business, everything. What am I going to do? And there is probably a different panic
And a repeat of the panic, because it's like there's one crisis and you think, okay, it's going to be okay now, and then whack, you're smacked again, and then you kind of get up from that, and then whack once again.
Yeah, but I think from my perspective, the same rule applies, or the same perspective applies, whether you're a large corporate, a president even, or a small business owner who has, two employees that, look at him or her to survive, with a wage that they need to get every week. I think the biggest piece that's missing from a lot of these conversations is around purpose. And I don't mean that as a throwaway comment or something that's a cliche, but I mean specifically saying, what is it that I, Wes, am trying to achieve in this business? And even more universally, what am I trying to achieve as a person? What drives me to start a business or to show up for an event or whatever the case may be? What is my purpose? But more importantly than my purpose, it's being able to share that purpose so people become aligned to and find commonality with that shared purpose. By doing that, you change the dynamics of how you're interacting. So you don't necessarily have to tell people to do certain things. Well, we need to do this because purpose, or we can't do that because of purpose, or we need to be driving towards this because of purpose. But because they now share that purpose, it becomes yin and yang. We don't have to focus on the silly stuff. We can focus on the stuff that we know that we need to do together. If that purpose is shared and becomes a common purpose, I think it's less likely that in the context of crisis, we have to do a lot of explaining. We have to take the time to say, well, we're trying to do this, and therefore fill in the blank. They know because they've bought into that same purpose. They know what we need to do next. And so it's less about trying to herd cats and more about trying to manage the periphery. And again, giving up control, trusting your people, because what we share is a purpose that both of us have bought into, whether that's communicating bad news, unpopular decisions, whatever it may be. If we're taking people on that journey, and that journey that we both can assign ourselves to in terms of purpose, I think we have a far greater opportunity to succeed than if everyone felt as if everyone was in it for themselves.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And for me, it's purpose and values alignment. And I think those two are kind of intertwined. Mm-hmm. My sense is that there's, in a number of organizations, there's a mismatch between the leader's purpose and their values and the values of the people. So there's this little bit of rub at the moment in terms of employees inquiring, is this the kind of leader I want to follow? Is there values alignment, or is there a mismatch and I need to find a different home? And I think there's a little bit of that happening right now, where the leaders are having to actually be their purpose, not just speak it, be their purpose and live from their values so that it can be really well seen. And I'm just wondering if leaders are really up to being that purpose without them feeling that they're going to be a little bit soft, because it's not soft, it's actually critical.
No, well, again, I think it's a really good point. This idea of being vulnerable, I said this the other day, vulnerability is a strength. And it takes a real leader to not so much admit, but confront and be transparent about their vulnerabilities, to articulate them in a way that, obviously they feel comfortable. But the idea is to just put that out there. I think it's less that leaders talk about their purpose, and more about the fact that they actually don't articulate it to themselves. So that the idea of being able to transfer or align with a leader's purpose doesn't take place, because, direct reports, the rest of the organization has no idea what those values or purpose is. And so they're responding to what they think the leader wants. It's kind of like, a bird that feeds their offspring. They sit there with their mouths open, waiting to be fed. Instead, they need to be a part of the hunt. They need to understand what we're trying to achieve together. So they're not waiting around to get a better sense of what's on offer. They're out getting it themselves because we're all focused on the same thing. So I think there's a sense of vulnerability that needs to be articulated. There's a sense of purpose and values, as you noted, that needs to be articulated and lived. So it's not just something that's, a poster on the wall or a phrase behind the desk. It's actually who we are and how we live our lives, both in the office and at home and in life.
Absolutely. How many times have we seen those plaques on the wall of companies of all their sayings and everything, but they weren't practicing what they were preaching. And over the years, the candidates who would go through the senior candidates who would go through these organizations, they were attracted to the companies who had that, what you were saying was that purpose, and the leader that had that purpose, but also that the communication was within the organization, that it was something that was actually lived. And also, you can't beat loyalty. Like when people, like the hardest candidate that I would have ever would be the candidate who was loyal to their leader, because you just can't get them out of an organization unless the opportunity is so wonderful. Because if they're loyal, they want to stay there. They want to finish what they started. They've got a purpose. They want to work for that person. That person's giving them the challenge and helping them in their career. And when times are bad, they have empathy and they help them through it. And everybody's doing it together. And it's rare. It actually is rare.
Well, it's so funny you should mention that, because Gallup runs these surveys and they've done it for a number of years. But one of the things that they talk about in terms of people staying or leaving an organization, it's less about the organization and more about their supervisor and what that supervisor or line manager provides them in terms of leadership. So again, back to purpose, it's probably unspoken in that context, but what they're saying, to your point around loyalty, is they're loyal to that individual's ability to let them be who they are, to get the best out of them, to become their full selves. And that idea of leaving that individual, and I'm sure the organization has some peripheral involvement in that question, but the idea, I'm aligned to and loyal to an individual. And if that person leaves, I'm likely to go with them because what they give me is fulfilling for myself and for them. And that's hard to replicate.
The easiest thing for me was when I was doing headhunting, is if a leader left, was to go in and get the ones right underneath them. Because I knew if that leader left and it was a strong culture and loyalty, that the people that reported to that leader would be worried about who the next person was going to be, unless they were in direct line for that role. So, but that was because people are scared. They're like going, if my boss who I love leaves, they're likely to come in and do a restructure, or they won't hire me into the role. So headhunters know to go in and headhunt the people directly under that leader, the good ones. So that you have
there are two things that CEOs tend to take along with them when they move from one role to the other. It's CFO and HR. In that order. And so it's not surprising the reason why a CEO or potential CEO would move to different organizations and have with him or her a team that operates, again, based on a shared purpose.
But you know what? I actually, and we've had this discussion before, Krystyna, and I've had this discussion before, but I actually don't think a person is a good leader if they leave one organization for another and take people from their current organization but I mean, maybe 12 months down the track, but not right away. And the reason being is because when they go to the new organization, this is my personal view, I personally feel that sends a message to everybody else who's there that those opportunities aren't for them. It kind of puts like they're going to bring their buddies over. As a headhunter, then what I would see when people did that is that the company that they were going to, the talented people were worried about that in that new company as well, and thought, oh, well, he or she's just going to bring their friends over or who they like, and where's my opportunity? And I could get people out of that company too. So it's a two-way thing. I always thought, we've had some conversations with some of the leaders that we've had on where their view has been to get to know the lay of the land first, get to know the company, see who the talent is, that type. And then if there are people that they do know from the past, they will put them through that process, but much, much later. And they have to go through a process.
I think that's the key. They have to go through the process. So you can't literally just say, hey, I'm bringing this person, and that person. I mean, success is important as an outcome. And I think the process through which people find success, again, whether that's the team around them, the organization culture, whatever that may be, they're more than likely wanting to take that culture or people or processes along with them. So it makes sense that if there has been, an inclusive culture in one organization, that CEO would go to another organization and want to literally pick up and take that inclusive culture with him or her. So I see it as the idea of going through a process, I think is definitely important, but I personally don't see anything wrong with an individual seeing success with a team and wanting to replicate that same success with that same team in another organizations, again, with the caveat that they need to go through a process to ensure that they've met the criteria of the role and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, having said that, just to clarify that, I had situations in the past where the underperforming company, so the company's underperforming and it's a disaster zone, and they want a new team, where I've had to bring the whole team over. So we've brought the general manager, but everybody comes.
Right. Oh boy.
Those are actually very good placements, by the way.
Yes, fair enough.
So Wes, what are some of the other skills that we haven't touched on yet that leaders need to have in crisis?
Oh, look, I mean, in that article that I wrote about the 7 habits of leaders in crisis, I kind of talk about, and to be honest, I think they're less grandiose or some new information. I think they're kind of habits that I think any leader that looks at what they're doing in the midst of crisis would kind of sit back and said, given what just took place, these are some of the things that I would advocate for myself or others who've been engaged in this process of crisis. So, the first one is around this idea of deliberative decision making, or being decisive in that context. And again, it has less to do with some great new idea, and more around the idea of bringing people to the table, both people who are supportive of your ideas and people who are not so supportive of your ideas, giving them equal weight and time for discussion, and making a decision based on that deliberative environment. I think all too often organizations, especially leaders, put around the table yes men and women who are only going to validate what they already know to be a perspective or their version of the truth. And they fail to bring in those people who have different but probably equally valuable ideas. The second one is around this notion of communicating objective truth. And again, I think in the midst of crisis, and I would make the caveat that most of these ideas around habits of leaders in crisis back to this idea of business as usual, I would suggest that these are habits that should take place all of the time, not just in crisis. But when it comes to communicating objective truth, it means to pull back from the emotion, you need to be dispassionate, and you need to be able to look objectively at actually what's taking place, and then push that out as one source of truth, as opposed to, a bunch of different alternative facts and those things that kind of ebb and flow with a person's personality, perspective, or means to an end. And I'll just give you one more. The idea of having a problem-solving mindset. I think a lot of people look at situations and their first reaction is, we can't get it done. Well, we can't do it. I think if you think through that, I talk often about starting with the end in mind, and literally reverse engineer your way through it, so that what you're able to do is, okay, this is going to be tough, but let's focus on where we want to get to. And I think if you just were to start there, to get consensus using the deliberative decisiveness process, looking at communicating objective truth, when you get to problem solving mindset, it's based on the idea that we all want to get to the same place, or agreeing to the place that we all want to get to, and working collaboratively to get there, taking as many people on that journey as possible so that you're not leaving anyone out. I'm working with an organization now, and the managing director said, well, Wes, how many people should be at the meeting? And I said, absolutely everyone. And he said, well, why? I said, because if we come to a point at which a decision is made on where we want to go forward, or how we want to go forward, it's important that everyone has skin in the game. Those people who weren't there won't know, won't have participated, and it's going to be more difficult for them to want to get on the bus, versus they may want to just say goodbye. I'm not ready to be a part of that because I wasn't part of the discussion in which those decisions were made. So if you just start with those three, say for, sharing authenticity, wanting to find success through others, it literally is, I would say, a roadmap for how leaders should lead, whether it's, again, in crisis or business as usual.
Yeah. Well, we've come up to our time, so we're going to start our little wrap-up conversation or wrap-up process. Judith, what are your key takeouts from our conversation with Wes today?
Well, if I look at leaders in crisis, one of the things that I would probably, say to people, that I love the idea of what you were saying before, Wes, about the problem-solving ability, because I think that is very important. But I also think that when leaders are leading, or when a crisis happens, an important aspect is making sure that you also have keep it positive. Like, keep it positive. What is the opportunity that we can find out of this crisis? So it might be, okay, we're all, during the pandemic, we all had to work from home and we can't go into the office, but what is it? Leaders need to be able to look at and go, what is it from this problem that we have, that we can find an opportunity? So we might have to change our business a little bit. We might have to work a little bit a different way, but we have an opportunity here. So I think good leaders in crisis need to have a visionary part to them as well, to sort of think past what the crisis is, and think that, okay, it's not just today. The crisis happened today, but it's probably going to go on for 12 months. How can we get through it, and what do we need to get through it? And I think keeping positive, being a leader who keeps positive, is really important, because that's the only way you're going to keep your team positive. You got to keep them motivated and them positive, and being a really good communicator, because everybody, like Wes was saying, you got to get everybody in that room. You got to get them all to that meeting and get them all involved, so they've all got a buy-in and they're all part of the decision.
Yeah, and the diversity of that group that gets together to make that decision or plot the course for making a decision is really important as well. So it can't just be, people who have a certain background or have graduated from a particular school. the innovation that comes from having differing opinions and differing backgrounds and perspectives is far more valuable than everyone making the same decision based on that sameness. So that diversity piece is really important, and that comes from this notion of inclusivity, innovation, and transparency, so that what you get is everything. And in fact, I think it's also having a vision, but it's also allowing your team to have a vision as well, and because that helps to move your vision in a way that is far more inclusive than just your vision on your own.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Also, as a leader, you need to make the people in your organization at every level, right? You know, the receptionist to the person in the back office feel comfortable enough that they can speak up, and they don't feel they're going to be shot down if they have an idea, or because some of the greatest ideas or partial ideas come from people who are thinking about it as a clear eye, fresh eye. So, where sometimes people in the more senior levels, they just think about it all the time. They only have one way to look at it. And then you get somebody out who's never really looked at it that way and goes, hey, well, why do you think about it this way? You go,
I mean, I tell people I have a degree in music composition and orchestration, and they go, how does that work? And I'm like, well, when I look at organizations, I think of it as literally a score sheet. I think of all of the instruments, down the left-hand side, and all of the measures across the top. And my role is to facilitate. It's to direct. It's say, I need you to be a little louder here. I need you to back off there. We need to increase the tempo. We need to slow down. But that's the way I brought, this kind of music component into the mix. But that's not like most of the folks that are sitting around a leadership table who have got business degrees, which I do as well, who have experiences in certain types of organizations. I write music. I've got a studio in my closet. How does that help? It provides a different perspective that, had it not been in the room, we may never have gone down that path, which may not be exactly the way I've gone, but I've helped to influence the conversation to come to a far more rounded and inclusive output.
And the execution journey is going to be smoother and more harmonious.
Yes, because 95% of entrepreneurs is not the idea, it's the execution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wes, on that note, thank you so much. It's been a fabulous conversation and we've absolutely loved having you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
For more information about Every Step and our guests, head to everysteppodcast.com. To be notified of new podcasts, please subscribe via your favourite listening platform. And of course, follow us on social media and direct message us to share your ideas about guests or topics.